Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Roald Dahl Retrospective, where we take a look at adaptations based off of Roald Dahl's shorts and books. I'm Patricia.
And my name is Arun.
So today we're going to be discussing about a little bit of an unorthodox one. Today we're going to be talking about Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood, which was distributed by the BBC. It was produced by the Roald Dahl Foundation, and it was written and directed by Donald Sturrock. Donald Sturrock was a journalist who had interviewed Roald Dahl around the late 80s during the last years of his life. And he had spent the last 10 years putting together all the interviews and cobbling it together for the autobiography that was released around 2010. And during the time he had become quite close with the Dahl family and the foundation, he had written and produced various ballets and plays based off of Roald Dahl books and shorts. And one of them was eventually shown on the BBC, and this is the one we're going to be talking about today. It is called Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood.
So you're going to have to forgive me here because, keep this in mind, as far as I'm aware, this didn't get, a proper release at any point. So I've seen, clips of it, and so my contribution here is going to be slightly limited compared to Patricia's contribution, so...
Yeah, it did get a VHS release, very similar to when we were discussing about Breaking Point. And yeah, as for television or any other releases, pretty much no. Very similar to Danny the Champion of the World and Breaking Point. They were only released in their respective countries. They had maybe one home video release, and then that's pretty much it. So once again, we're going into a very, very obscure Roald Dahl adaptation. In fact, out of all the ones that we've talked about, this is hands down the most obscure. Very few people know about this.
And one of the things you got to keep in mind when talking about, well, why on earth did this not get this release, and why did it get this release? Back in the 90s and back in the 80s, the BBC only comprised of probably maybe two outlets, and probably 4 radio stations if you were lucky to get basically onto a radio drama. And even if you did that, you only got one radio station, which was BBC Radio 4. So in regards to the BBC and the amount of archive that they probably have millions of hours of footage and documentaries and other stuff as well. So unfortunately, what we're talking about today is probably somewhere in that archive, or probably as a VHS on eBay somewhere. So the idea of the BBC at the time is that obviously all the premiere and all the great programming that they deemed that was going to be in the majority public interest got released onto these 1 or 2 channels that was there at the time. So you had things like Noel's House Party, you had things like Top of the Pops, you had things like Live and Kicking, you had things like, he had other shows as well. University Challenge, obviously a major show that the BBC put on for a number of years. He had, Mastermind was also something else as well, which was a big popular show. So as you can probably imagine, there was a lot of production companies. There was a lot of things to be released on BBC programming. And unfortunately, there was stuff that was produced that just either fell by the wayside, went onto VHS, or, unfortunately, is still in an archive somewhere, still waiting to be released or still waiting to be discovered. And that's just the nature of television that was in Britain for a good 20-30 years.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I'm just looking at the cast of this movie. So we have Ian Holm, who most people probably nowadays know as, who played as Bilbo Baggins in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then we have Julie Walters. A lot of people may know her as Mrs. Weasley from the Harry Potter movies. making this our second actor who has been in the Harry Potter movies, who also was in a Roald Dahl adaptation. The first one we discussed about was Robbie Coltrane, aka Rubius Hagrid, who was in Danny the Champion of the World as Mr. Hazel. And then finally the one that really just like blew my mind as to who was in this movie, Danny DeVito as the wolf.
Mm-hmm. And, well, keep this in mind, like, you would obviously think that, Danny DeVito has played some notorious characters in the past. Keep this in mind, he was Matilda's dad in Matilda. So, Danny DeVito also had kind of not a villainous role, but he also had kind of a sleevely role in Mars Attacks as well. So, Danny DeVito does have form in regards to playing, villains in this. So, it would not be too unusual for him to play the big bad wolf in this situation.
Yeah, believe it or not, Matilda was not the only Roald Dahl adaptation that he was in. It was actually Little Red Riding Hood, and it came out a year before Matilda. Although, to be fair, he did the voiceover. I don't think he was in the wolf costume. So, yeah, I think that let's get things started. So, basically, it starts off with a narrator. I have no idea who it is. Some guy who just comes along and spouts out that, there is danger in the forest and it's mysterious and you have to be quiet. And it just goes on a really long tangent. It kind of starts off at the end where Little Red Riding Hood is in the limousine. And so it kind of opens up with a truck picking up baby sheep and pig. Oh, by the way, these are anthropomorphic animals. This looks like akin to something like the live-action Alice in Wonderland and the Wind in the Willows, the 80s and 90s version, not the Tim Burton version and the the more recent Wind in the Willows. That's not what I was referring to. So, yeah, they're basically anthropomorphic animals, and they are human-like. So it starts off with this truck coming on by, and they're picking up the baby sheep and the baby pigs, and they're putting them into this truck for them to be taken away. And you have the mothers saying goodbye to them. And it starts off really dark, like, oh my God.
Well, you got to keep this in mind, Patricia, that Roald Dahl is no, is not a guy with an audience looking specifically at children. I mean, one of the things keep in mind, he was partly involved in 36 Hours in regards to coming up with that. But if you look at some of the darker elements that he did, I mean, keep in mind, I would say that the BFG in itself is a very dark creation that he came up with. I mean, it was about a bunch of giants that was going around gobbling up, human beings, quote unquote, human people. So, I mean, it was, and also on top of that as well, you had what happened with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where you had Willy Wonka in the place where he was putting children basically in harm's way. And you could say rightfully so. I mean, if you're really, of that side of that. But you got to keep in mind, I mean, that's where Roald Dahl's head was at the time. And that's basically the things that he wanted to create. And so that in itself would be very telling of what Roald Dahl was and what his creative genius were mainly was part of. And so, any dark elements we're going to see here is not surprising whatsoever.
That is very true. You're absolutely right. That Roald Dahl does tend to delve into very dark moments. Like we already talked about the tunnel scene in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. We talked about how in The Witches, that the witches are taking these children and they are destroying them by luring them into like sweet shops and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, that is to be expected. But here's the thing, like this part of the special has absolutely nothing to do with the original telling of Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood. Now, it is derived from a series of shorts called Revolting Rhymes. Revolting Rhymes is a series of fairy tales from Cinderella, The Three Little Pigs, Jack and the Beanstalk. They were just rewritten into the perspective of Roald Dahl. So they're completely different than what we're familiar with.
In one of these Revolting Rhymes, Little Red Riding Hood pulls a gun on the wolf.
Yeah, that's what happens at the end, too. So, yes, that's true. Like in, Roald Dahl's interpretation of Little Red Riding Hood and in The Three Little Pigs, Little Red Riding Hood pulls out a gun, kills the wolf, and makes him into a fur coat. Yeah, so continuing on, the narration is just going on and on and on, and like 7 minutes in, that's when we see the limousine pulling up to the grandma's house, and then the narrator's like, "Oh, we've gotten to the end of the story. We need to go back to the beginning." I felt that the narration was just dragging.
Keep this in mind with, I mean, what year are we talking about here for this Little Red Riding Hood production?
1995.
Exactly. So, I mean, in that time, I mean, one of the things I noticed with BBC with their storytelling is that the narration is one thing that they always seem to go through. And I think this comes from, just the BBC being so radio heavy, I think, at the time. And so one of the things you'll notice in a lot of British television is that it doesn't rely incredibly much on physical humor. I mean, okay, there's the Faulty Towers and the Father Teds and the other comedy, Are You Being Served, Hello, Hello, and various other comedies of this world. But for the various like dramas and for the various productions and the elaborate productions that they do, one of the things you'll notice is that there always has to be like a type of narration that's involved. I mean, nowadays in BBC productions, what's you see on the screen pretty much tells the story, unless you're adapting from one of the Radio 4 plays, and then therefore obviously you got narration going forth. But so it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that this would have a ton of explanation and narration to go with it, because in 1995, I mean, you'll notice that a lot of BBC programming that was there at the time did rely on that type of thing.
Okay, well, that's completely fair. And to be fair, I mean, you're taking a short story that if we were to read it, it would last less than 3 minutes. So you're trying to take that and adapt it into a 45-minute production. Now, from what I understand, this is based off of the stage play, and I'm sure that the stage play, they go into a lot of depth with it as well, what they were trying to do, because Donald Sturrock, who also wrote and produced the stage play, wrote and directed the BBC production. So I think that they were trying to do that. They were trying to essentially adapt the stage play into a Christmas special, because it came out on Christmas of 1995. What I really do appreciate about the 2016 or the 2017 BBC animated adaptation is that they actually mixed the other Roald Dahl fairy tales into essentially like a two-part movie. Like, in addition to Little Red Riding Hood, there's also Cinderella, there's also the Three Little Pigs, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So they felt that, okay, it's a little bit too short. Let's see if we can mix it up so we can make a cohesive story. And that was basically, for my personal opinion, that was a way better adaptation than this. Now, again, I know a lot of people, I saw through the comments when I was seeing this video on YouTube, and I know a lot of people really like this adaptation, especially for those who grew up with it. But as mentioned before, with stuff such as Danny the Champion of the World and The Witches, if there's a problem and if there's flaws in it, I'm going to point it out. I'm sorry.
A lot of things are going to have cult followings. I mean, there's a lot of shows, and not just here on what we on the Roald Dahl Retrospective, but in various other things that we've seen. I mean, like there's going to be a small grouping of people or a medium-sized grouping of people who are going to like this, and if you do like it, then fair play. But, obviously we look at this as an outsider looking in and find that there's problems with it, and we're going to point them out. And so, I mean, we don't look at this as, through the scope of a fan. I mean, don't get me wrong. We're fans of animation. We're fans of like things from the 90s, and we're fans from things even from the 80s. But if we're not invested all that much into it, and we're going to look at this from an analysis point of view, and that's what you're listening to here comes to exist as. So there we go.
Yeah. So basically, we have the introduction of the wolf, who isn't the big bad wolf. Actually, he's very dapper, like very dressed up, like very sophisticated. And then we have the actual wolf in the story, whose name is Wolfey. And then this is when they start deriving the rhymes from Revolting Rhymes, in which, he was talking about, like, I want to go over and want to get something to eat because I'm hungry. And so I'm going to knock over into the grandma's house and I'm going to, do that. But then it doesn't go there right away. Next, we spend the next 10 minutes with a severe thunderstorm and severe winds that the wolf is trapped in. And then we cut back into the truck where the sow and the sheep are gathering together the baby pigs and the baby lambs, and they're essentially going to be doing something really bad to them. And then it cuts over to Little Red Riding Hood, and there's just a lot of cutting in between, which is definitely like dragging the special. Another reoccurring thing with these Roald Dahl adaptations is that they have so much filler in it.
Well, it was done in front of a live audience, wasn't it?
No, it was not.
It was not. Okay, then I'm thinking of something else. But with these type of productions, there's going to be a lot of cutting and swaying forward. I would be interested to see what happens if they did this live. This was like a live thing that they recorded and they put it all together at that time. I'd be interested to see what they would have done.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. If this would have been a stage play, which I think would have been probably a lot more forgiving as to why some scenes kind of drag, that's perfectly understandable. As we mentioned in the Roald Dahl retrospective, there have been a lot of books from Roald Dahl that have been adapted into plays. James and the Giant Peach, the BFG, The Witches, Matilda, which, by the way, as of the recording of this podcast, it was announced that the Broadway version of Matilda is going to be getting a theatrical release. That is to be expected that, with these kind of scenes, they tend to drag things out, right before they get over to the main plot of the story. That's fine. But because this is a BBC production, I guess it will be akin to something like, those NBC productions, the ones that are going on live, except that this didn't go on live. And it wasn't surrounded by a viewing audience. It was just like they showed it on TV, then it was released on VHS, and that was pretty much it. So if it was shown live in front of a studio audience or played live on TV, I think it definitely would have been a lot less grating, in my opinion. But, I would have been a little bit more forgiving of it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm continuing on. So Wolfey, that's the name of the wolf, by the way. So Wolfey finally approaches the grandmother's house, and then he spouts out his rhyme, and then he eventually eats her. And so then it starts sticking a lot closer to the Revolting Rhymes poem, in which when he's not satisfied, he's going to dress up as Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. And then finally, we do get to see Julie Walters as Little Red Riding Hood. And, she goes up to the grandma and she says, "Oh, grandma, what big eyes you have." And then, it's like, "Oh, better to see you with, my dear," and all that stuff. But then she doesn't mention about like, "Oh, but grandma, why are you so hairy? What's your big nose?" And then the wolf stands up and is like, "You're supposed to say, 'Oh, grandma, what big teeth you have.'" And he says, "The better to eat you with, my dear." And instead of the woodsman going over to save Little Red Riding Hood, in both Revolting Rhymes and in this special, she pulls out a pistol and she shoots him dead. Yeah, and the special ends with Little Red Riding Hood approaching her house, and she's approaching her house and she's dressed up in the wolf's fur coat, and that's how it ends. So essentially, it's basically the Revolting Rhymes Little Red Riding Hood story. It's stretched out, and then you have this whole thing about the pigs and the sheep. They were eventually rescued and they were okay, so that whole part of the story is over. And then the other wolf shows up and he's like, ready to take on revenge. But that wolf is actually going to be the wolf featured in the Three Little Pigs short. I guess maybe they wanted to like follow up with that. Like maybe they would have focused on that wolf, and then, they would have done the story of the Three Little Pigs, and then Little Red Riding Hood would have come at the end and shoot him, and then she would have had 2 fur coats. So, I mean, I guess, we wouldn't see that adaptation until, as mentioned before, the 2016 or 2017 animated adaptation of Revolting Rhymes. So,
I would just ask you, Patricia. I mean, remember that 3D animated thing of Little Red Riding Hood? Was it Hoodwinked? What was it called?
Oh, that's right, Hoodwinked. Yeah.
Hoodwinked. Yeah. How much more fun would it have been if Little Red Riding Hood in the end had shot the wolf dead? Or would it have just made it worse?
I mean, here's the thing. The wolf in Hoodwinked is a major character. He's played by Patrick Warburton. So essentially, you have Red, the wolf, and the grandma, and they would come together. You actually bring up an interesting point, Aaron. It's like Hoodwinked came out at a time in which when Shrek was like the biggest thing in the world when it came to 3D animation. Everybody wanted to copy off of Shrek. The Hoodwinked movies, Happily Never After. There was just so many fairy tale spoofs and homages. And I'm just curious.
I only ask. I mean, I didn't bring it up as an interesting point. I mainly just ask it because if Little Red Riding Hood shot the wolf dead, then we wouldn't have got that awful sequel.
Yeah, that's true. We wouldn't have gotten that awful sequel. That's very true. We wouldn't have gotten that awful sequel. But yeah, I mean, like, that would have been interesting if they would have shown that depiction. It's like, hey, it's the classic story of Little Red Riding Hood. And we have this, I mean, like in, the BBC production, I mean, Little Red Riding Hood was an adult and Red in Hoodwinked was a child. And, I mean, like in the grandma, she was able to do karate. So I'm sure she would have not been able to be eaten by the wolf. So
I'm pretty sure about that, yeah. So, but anyway, moving back on to the BBC variation of this. So, people will look at overall of this and think, oh, hey, this is pretty, strange for, or at least, a bit, unpleasant for the viewing audience. But you got to keep this in mind. Like, one, it was the 90s, and so as far as I'm concerned, the rule book was not written. I mean, whether it was budgetary things or whether it was, how far could you actually go with television shows. I mean, there was no real written rule book at that time, back in 1995. I mean, it was just like they just, if they thought it was going to make people laugh and it was going to make people entertained and things like that, they just threw it up there and did it, And so it was. There's a lot of things in the 90s in the BBC programming that you probably could look at and think, there's no way they could get away with that today.
If you were to do Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood today, I mean, which technically they did because we did talk about the animated adaptation, but like something like this, there is no way you were going to have the scene in which when the baby pigs and the baby sheep were taken away in the truck. Like, that is dark. And also, you weren't going to get Little Red Riding Hood shooting the wolf with a gun. There's no way that would have happened.
Unfortunately, Patricia, we live in a day where, unfortunately, someone's got to get offended and somebody has got to basically complain and therefore, ruin the whole fun for everybody because of either that one particular joke or that one particular thing that, unfortunately, for one group of people, it's not inclusive enough, so therefore it's not gonna fly on national TV. And that's the reason why these streaming sites and things like that are getting far more traction because they are taking risks and they are offending somebody out there, and eventually they're gonna basically pick up the pieces where all these other places where you're not allowed to be edgy or you're not allowed to basically take risks anymore, they're going to get a slice of the pie. And but the BBC at the time and ITV, they didn't have those kind of worries at that time when they were producing all this stuff. And so, of course they could get away with that because that was just a non-factor at the time.
Yeah. So overall, in my personal opinion, I do have issues with this special. I find that it drags a lot and there's pointless filler and that there might be some moments that might be too scary for kids. But at least I can commend that it was taking a risk. It was adapting a stage play into a TV production. So I can respect it for that. And, I can respect also the fact that they were able to stick pretty close to the poem. Like, if Roald Dahl was alive seeing this, I think he would have been pretty satisfied because, they say line for line of the book, and they were able to keep the original ending where Little Red Riding Hood shot the wolf with a pistol and walked away with a fur coat. So for over 20 or 30 years, Donald Sturrock has been doing nothing more than respecting the legacy of the Roald Dahl Foundation. He's been doing stage plays and ballets based off of his books and shorts. He wrote the autobiography and put together the letter compilations from him and his mother. So you can tell that he has a ton of respect for Roald Dahl. And I do give him credit for
as well. Like, I think if Roald Dahl at any point had any reservations about Danny DeVito, I guarantee you he probably, if he did some research and looked to the fact that, Danny DeVito also was the Penguin in Batman Returns, I guarantee you Roald Dahl will be looking to get him in a heartbeat.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I think that for the most part, if you are interested in checking it out, it's on YouTube for those who can't buy, for those who don't have a VHS and, that plays Region 2 tapes lying around. But yeah, I mean, I would take a look into this and I would just put my expectations in a point in which, like, okay, it's 45 minutes long. It's based on a stage play. It's based off of a part of a series of short stories that are less than 3 minutes long to read. And, it's going to be dragging at times, and there might be some scenes that maybe shouldn't even be there. So, but at the same time, you can definitely give it a lot of credit of what it was trying to do. I think it definitely plays more into the risks than, say, like Danny the Champion of the World or Breaking Point, in which, like, Danny the Champion of the World was playing it really safe in a time in which when Roald Dahl was so bitter about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and Breaking Point just basically copied 36 Hours and added in some things that were just kind of weak compared to the original. So I can give credit to Roald Dahl's Little Red Riding Hood, despite of its flaws.
Exactly, but I mean, in regards to, whether it would have been Roald Dahl's absolute favorite thing, you got to keep in mind the BFG still exists.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so yeah, guess what, Aaron? We have officially reached the halfway point of the Roald Dahl retrospective.
Yeah, and if you all thought that we're anywhere near the end, nope. I guarantee you we've got a lot more entertainment to come.
Yes, exactly. But we have finally reached out of the point of the early to mid 90s worth of obscurity, and now we're going to go into the really good stuff. So tune in next time as we're going to be talking about James and the Giant Peach.
And until then, we bid you adieu.
All right, take care.